Okay. So thank you everyone for attending today. We are going to begin our presentation on the UDO stormwater articles. Very quickly, I'll run through our sort of staff that are on the call. Today, we have from our stormwater team, Robert Zink, Kate Labadorf, Jay Wilson, Jordan Miller, Daryl Hammock. And I think that's it from stormwater. From planning, we have Allison Craig, Deputy Planning Director, Laura Harmon, the UDO Project Manager, Alan Goodwin, Kevin May, Mariah Wozniak, Sandra Montgomery, Yolanda Jones, and myself, Andrew Russell. And let me see, make sure I didn't miss anybody. Oh, and Katie Burkett, also on the UDO team. And with that, we'll advance to the next slide. So for today, the meeting procedure is going to be that we are going to be going through some slides, going through some high-level sort of summaries of the changes coming in the UDO related to stormwater. And as we work through them, our slides, feel free to drop questions into the chat. That's going to be the only place where you can sort of let us know that you have a question. Everyone will be muted. We want to try and cut down on background noise, but essentially what we're going to do is at the end, if there's a good question that isn't able to be answered in the chat, we will spend some time at the end of the presentation going through those questions. The meeting purpose today is about what you'd expect. We're going to go through all of the stormwater articles and the proposed changes, and then answer questions about those articles at the end. So this is a slide, if you've been to these presentations before, you've seen this probably 7 times now, but essentially what we're trying to remind folks is why we're doing this. The UDO is the primary regulatory tool to implement the vision of the Charlotte Future 2040 Comprehensive Plan. Updating the standards gives us greater predictability for future development. It gets us more aligned standards, so it updates maybe language today that was written over the past 30 years by different city departments, all getting one update at the same time to align them all. In addition, there's a component of this that sort of updates standards to match best practice, consolidation, and simplification, and also a big goal. But in general, we see this as a much more user-friendly ordinance than the zoning ordinance and the ordinances, stormwater ordinances that are out there today. In addition to that, there's some legal requirements we're trying to meet. The North Carolina 160D legislation has requirements for local governments in what we can regulate as a municipality. In terms of the UDO content, if you're not familiar with this, the UDO is structured kind of in 4 main buckets. You have zoning, which includes land uses and zoning districts, subdivision, streets, and other infrastructure, which includes streets, sidewalks, subdivision, and then stormwater and natural resources will be the home for all the articles that we're talking about today. You'll be able to find everything from water supply watersheds all the way down to floodplain and soil erosion and sedimentation in that section. And then there's also provisions in the UDO for administration and enforcement that are going to be at the end of the UDO. Just to give everybody a good high-level overview of the schedule of the UDO, we are currently in the first public draft phase, and that phase will run through January 2022. Essentially, the big date to keep in mind in this whole process is July 2022 adoption. There are going to be several drafts and opportunities for this us to update the UDO as we hear from the public, but the ultimate goal is to have this put before City Council for adoption in July. And then in terms of the connection, it's always important to remember that all of the standards that we include in the UDO have a connection to City Council or city adopted policy. So the policy sets out the vision and the guidance for growth and development. And the ordinances set the actual standards and the numbers that control how that vision is achieved. So you see here sort of a list of the current articles or ordinances that are existing city law, and they are being consolidated into the UDO. So you see there, post-construction stormwater, floodplain regulations, erosion control today have their own chapter in the Code of Ordinances. In the future, those are going to be in the UDO. In addition, it's important to point out that the zoning ordinance today contains requirements for swim buffers and water supply watershed protection. And then some flood study requirements and subdivision are also going to be moved into the articles that are in stormwater and natural resources in the UDO. So that was fast, but with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jordan Miller with Stormwater Services to take on the rest of the presentation.
All right, thanks, Andrew. Thumbs up on audio. Great,
Good.
thanks. So we'll fly through these a little bit quickly. Some of the sections are minimal changes. So again, any questions, let us know. So the water supply watershed requirements are currently housed in the zoning ordinance as overlay districts. 2 of the 3 are required by state law to protect the city's water supply. So we get the vast majority of our drinking water, those of us on public drinking water supply, from the Catawba River Lake system. So these regulations are to make that water as clean as possible. You can go ahead in the next one. So some quick facts, there's 3 watersheds, and you can see the green, the purple, and the sort of tan and brown. You've got the Mountain Island Lake water supply watershed, the Lake Wiley or Catawba watershed, and then the Lower Lake Wiley. The first 2 are those required by state law, and the last is a locally adopted ordinance on its own merit. Those have effective dates ranging from 1993 to 2001. And the requirements generally include built upon area limits. Built upon area would be impervious or semi-impervious materials like gravel and rooftops and driveways. And they also generally have some stormwater control requirements through providing some on-site measures to slow and detain and treat runoff. And then also some stream buffers on perennial streams and along the actual lake and river system shoreline. So really, most of the changes are more administrative in nature. So of course, it's moving from the zoning ordinance to the stormwater section of the UDO. All the watersheds are going to be combined into one article. Currently, there's 3 separate ordinance sections, and it's very repetitive. So taking the opportunity to minimize the text. And in doing so, we're also converting a lot of text to tables. Just from a user-friendly perspective, it's a lot easier to work with from staff and folks using the ordinance to draft plans. And then cleaning up some language, some of these dating back to 93, just language has evolved. So just trying to align language across stormwater ordinances and articles, as well as some of the definitions. So not a lot of actual change, mostly just updating. The next slide just kind of shows an example of the current ordinance on the left, where we have very sort of bulleted text example, and then on the right is an early draft. It actually looks a little different in the proposed UDO that's out for review, but just an example of kind of converting that to a table, hopefully making it a little bit easier for folks to understand and use. And so that's all we have on watershed today. I'm going to pass it over to Kate to talk about drainage.
Thanks, Jordan. So the drainage, the types of development that we're seeing in Charlotte have changed from large subdivisions to infill, and the current drainage requirements are not keeping up with these changes. We're finding more and more development related issues and receiving more development related calls. Next slide. So currently staff reviews commercial multifamily subdivision type development, but we don't review infill single lot developments, exempt minor subdivisions, these smaller types of development. And these are the things that we're seeing more and more of as Charlotte intensifies. Next slide. So as this infill development increases, we're finding issues, excuse me, related to development. We're getting more calls and that kind of stuff. Over the last 2 years, we've received over 200 of these types of calls. So these are drainage issues called in related to infill development. And some of these issues include where people have gone in and modified the city drainage system, either removing or changing the existing system or connecting to it. New structures, additions, pools, homes that are built within existing drainage easements, sometimes over existing pipes, which makes maintenance of these systems more difficult. Installing inadequate systems or using poor construction methods, driveways that are in conflict with existing drainage, like they'll put a driveway where a current catch basin is, and then remove the catch basin. Building structures that flood. So we're getting calls of new structures that have just been built and property owners have just moved in and the structure's flooding already. Developing property in a way that creates flooding for adjacent properties, and then developing in areas of known flooding. Sometimes the only land left are areas that are low-lying areas that are subject to flooding. And so as development intensifies, some of these lots are being developed that haven't been developed historically. Next slide. This is just an overall outline of the article. Currently, there's not a drainage article per se in the development ordinances. So this is kind of pulling together things that are spread out now into one place. And it's organized basically looking at 4 different sections: encroachments, runoff and conveyance, flooding, and easements. Next slide. So the potential key changes is it's basically taking the requirements of today and applying it to smaller sites. So this first one's talking about encroachments for where there's existing drainage easements and buildings and structures are being built in those easements. This would, the only thing we see currently are the larger developments. And so we're not seeing the smaller single lot developments. And so we don't know until the house has been built or something that they're encroaching in an easement. It's also establishing a process to be able to tie into the city system. So we're not trying to prevent the tie-ins. We're just trying to be at the table early on so that things can be done efficiently and appropriately. Next slide. And then as far as stormwater conveyance, adequate conveyance is checked and easements are provided for larger development sites, subdivisions, commercial, those kind of things. What we're proposing is to do these same kind of checks for the smaller sites. So specifically, if you're installing or modifying drainage that conveys runoff from a public street, making sure that what's being put in the ground is appropriate. Next slide. And then the last thing is that subdivisions currently have flood protection lines established to help guide construction away from flood-prone zones and areas. This would have that same type of protection provided for the smaller single lot developments and stuff to help prevent buildings from being built that immediately flood. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Jordan.
All right. So the city's post-construction stormwater ordinance is a existing ordinance, and it is required through the city's National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit as a result of the Clean Water Act. So it's an existing ordinance that will be moving over into the UDO with some proposed modifications. And we do have some minimum requirements that are often set by state law. Next, please. So the overview and purpose is to protect and maintain and enhance the public health, safety, and environment. And we do that by minimizing the impacts of stormwater runoff, generally associated with non-point source pollution with development and redevelopment. So we've got to try and improve the surface water quality and minimize impacts and damage to property and infrastructure. One key term I mentioned earlier is built upon area. It's generally defined as impervious or partially impervious materials, but you'll hear that come up a lot. So this is a chart like Kate just showed, where you've got a current proposed, and then the reference on the right will either be the UDO text or potentially a reference to an existing ordinance section. So one of the big changes proposed is currently there are applicability triggers that differ based on commercial or residential development. And the proposed UDO aligns those and does lower the trigger for all development. Currently, it's 20,000 square feet of built upon area for commercial and 24% built upon area for single family residential. So we've proposed to align that and lower that to 5,000 square feet. And you can see the reference text there. Also, the existing ordinance requires built upon area that's being redeveloped to provide stormwater controls to treat and detain that. State law changed a few years ago to prohibit that. And so we are required to update our ordinance to comply with that legislation. So that redeveloped built upon area will not be required to be treated on private projects. And then currently there's a section on natural area and post-construction to preserve or revegetate areas of the site. And the natural area requirements are proposed to be translated or have been into the tree protection article. So all those tree requirements will be in one article of the UDO. Next. And then kind of in the same vein of the redevelopment issues, there are currently a lot of mitigation options available for specific geographic locations or for redevelopment projects. And so those have been proposed to be removed and require on-site for all sites to make sure that we get the same mitigation at the impact locations throughout the city. And that occurs in several sections of the existing ordinance referenced there on the right. And then similarly, industrially zoned properties have been allowed to provide different on-site measures. And so we have proposed to remove that inconsistency and just align the requirements across all development types and the sections of existing ordinance and proposed, of course, over there. And then the last one there is we have some zoning ordinance required detention that's been in place since the late 70s. And so we'll be translating that into or have translated that into the proposed post-construction section of UDO, and the references there as well. And I think these are the last two. Currently, the city can accept maintenance of SCMs when certain single-family developments meet certain criteria, and that has been proposed to just require SCMs to be maintained by the property owner regardless of development type. Again, sort of in the same vein as aligning requirements across development. And then also we have stream buffers in post-construction where there's a lot of allowable impacts that can be mitigated. And there's a proposal in the UDO to restrict built upon area within the first 15 feet from the stream. And that's a lot of sections you can see there referenced. And so that's all we have for post-construction. And I'll talk a little bit about the surface water improvement and management or SWIM buffers. These have been around since 1999 and they're currently in the zoning ordinance. The main goal is to protect water quality and protect that area surrounding the streams for shading, temperature control, habitat, filtering of pollutants, vegetative cover, all good things for the stream. And so we're going to be shifting that into a section of the UDO next. And you can see here, as I mentioned, these went into effect in 1999 and they apply to intermittent perennial streams that drain at least 100 acres throughout the city. It's a screenshot there from a city GIS application. And the widths vary from 35 to 100 feet, 100 feet and more. Next. Here's an updated graphic just showing that there's different zones of this buffer with, as you get closer to the stream, generally more protective and restrictive, so as to protect the most vital portions of that stream. Next. And so the potential key changes, obviously moving from one ordinance to another, and then removing some older exemptions that no longer apply or just don't really work with today's ordinances. Again, cleaning up language and definitions with all of the stormwater regulations to make sure they're as consistent as possible. And then also aligning with the water supply and post-construction buffer requirements so we can try to keep those the same across. And then we did remove or propose to remove some underused and outdated buffer mitigation options that are quite honestly never used. And then I think touch on these. The next two, we don't have any real slides for floodplain. There's no major changes proposed, and it was recently updated and adopted by council last year. Some changes to that ordinance. And I believe the last one is next. Yeah, soil erosion and sedimentation control. And so you can see there, we don't propose any major changes other than, typical alignment and text. Kick it back to Andrew.
Thanks, Jordan. I have not paid attention to the chat, but I see there was one question that Daryl answered in the chat. I'll give folks another minute or two to type in questions. We did receive one question. Let me see if I can find that. Thank you to those who submitted questions before through the registration page. The question that we got, and this one I think could be for Jordan or anybody else who wants to take it on, but are there any changes to the interpretation of impervious, or in parentheses as gravel? Do the existing site impervious, or does the existing site impervious still factor into the calculations?
So the definition of built upon area is not changing, which does include gravel. Generally, the definition of impervious does not, and that's currently used in the zoning ordinance. So all of that would remain the same. And then as far as existing built upon area, that would also remain the same. We've got some good examples we can provide, but generally speaking, if you redevelop a site and there's existing built upon area there, then that's removed from your calculations on what's required to be treated. So I'd say all of that is going to be more or less the same as it is today. I don't anticipate any changes, at least that we're proposing.
Great. And I'm going to drop that question into the chat so we have it for a record. But Nadia asked, can you explain this a bit more? Does this have any applicability to public infrastructure? So just to rehash, the question from Nadia was, are there any requirements for or encouragement of, such as incentives for green infrastructure, particularly handling more stormwater on site, reduce downstream conveyance? This would coordinate with expand comp plan environmental goals. And Daryl answered it, but wanting some more discussion about that. I don't know if anybody wants to jump in. You should be able to unmute.
I mean, I can, Daryl, jump in if you want. But specific to the public infrastructure, yeah, I mean, public projects do have to comply with the post-construction requirements. So new roadways and those types of things. And so I think the easy answer to your question would be yes. It does have applicability to public infrastructure if you're talking about those roadway type projects or other public infrastructure like, fire stations, police stations, rail lines, and that kind of thing. Hopefully that helps.
Nadia asked, like bioswales instead of pipes. What do you think about that?
So I'd say those have always been an option. I would say it depends. I've worked a lot with folks like CDOT and their projects in the past few years and how they want to comply with these regulations. And we don't generally direct how to comply. And so, yes, you could use a bioswale to get some partial credit for maybe some water quality requirements, and you may still have to have some detention requirements. So could that happen? Yes, I think it generally comes down to a project level decision of, does it make sense for that project to do one or the other? So is it an option? Absolutely. Does the change in the UDO mean that we'll have more of that? Maybe not necessarily.
Daryl, so I saw Daryl commented that he couldn't unmute. Daryl, you should be able to unmute. Try one more time if you want to jump in.
Yeah, thank you. I think Jordan hit upon it. We required green infrastructure on our sites. That's a really big part of controlling downstream flooding, improving downstream runoff. And the individual sites vary quite a bit, and the degree to which that is able to be accommodated varies. But in every case, the requirements of the ordinance have to be met.
Yeah, no, I'll add, Nadia, just to answer your last question there, or last comment about the sort of requirements. The requirements do require that all these things are met. They can just be done. Maybe they can be done in an underground chamber, or maybe they can be done in a bioswale. So it's not so much that they won't be providing water quality treatment and detention. It's just what methods they use to show that compliance. Hopefully that helps, but I hear your comment.
Great. The next question that I see is from Joe Padilla. Are mitigation options changing in post-construction? Many infill sites are challenged when it comes to providing on-site controls.
Short answer, yes, Joe. So sections 18-161A through C are all proposed to be removed in the UDO, and those were all those mitigation options that I know you're aware of. So those are being removed, and a lot of that has to do with often or most of the time those are used to meet redevelopment requirements that are no longer required. So we've seen a extreme reduction in use of those sections, and so the goal here would be to get whatever level of compliance we can on site for whatever amount of built upon area is required to be treated.
All right. The next question was from Faith, and it says, what is staff's thoughts on new mitigation measures that you'd like to see, or expansion of fines to encourage compliance?
Faith, do you mind clarifying if that was for a specific section? I don't want to speak out of turn.
I'll let Faith, let's table that one for now. Faith, you can type in your clarification into the chat if you want. We'll come back to you. Because I see we have a couple other ones. From Mark Mattia, does yard debris cause any issues with clogging / blocking storm drains?
Yeah, I added in the chat down there that it does. Yes, yard debris sometimes does. If there's debris left in the yard and a big storm comes and stuff, the water can carry it in and cause it to block or clog storm drains.
Great. Hermes Good said, not sure if it's directly related, but have creative solutions been considered to be required in new or existing public property, commercial or street drains to prevent litter from entering drainage systems or waterways?
I'll jump in on that just for a second. I think one of the things that comes to my mind is that all of these stormwater control measures that are required as part of the post-construction ordinance capture all the runoff from the site. And when they capture the runoff, trash tends to be collected in that space as well. And so where you're probably seeing trash in the drainage system or in creeks is where there are no controls. And that's one of the goals we have for the ordinances right now, is to expand the number of sites that have to comply with ordinances and have to potentially have those types of basins. And so I think if we're able to do that, you'll probably see a reduction in trash. Although that may not be the primary goal, that is a definite benefit to the downstream receiving waters, that less trash will leave a site as more and more of those basins are put in.
Yeah, that's a good answer. So going back to Faith, she was talking specifically about water supply watershed. And to rehash that question is, what are staff's thoughts on new mitigation measures that you'd like to see, or expansion of fines to encourage compliance, and then specifically for water supply watersheds?
Yes, I know that the compliance and enforcement section of water supply watershed was revised because for one easy reason is that it was moving from zoning and code enforcement over to stormwater. So I know that was updated. I've been frantically trying to get my PDF to open over here so I can get you specifics. I think we can provide contact info, and I'm happy to get you specifics on what the new language says. For whatever reason, it's not functioning right now. So, but yes, we did update that. Some of that is tied to, or most of that is tied to what's allowed under the state enabling legislation for those. But I can get you specifics on that. And it is changing some due to the movement from ordinance to UDO.
Great. Question from Sylvia Biddle-Patton. Question regarding post-construction ordinance. Had an issue with a developer who requested and was granted a variance post-construction regarding a retention detention pond. After a later development occurred that was able to be built by right, there were some downstream sedimentation issues. Now a third developer is being asked to agree to some terms for future development projects that have more to do with the previous variance decisions that were approved by the city. So how will the UDO, the proposed UDO, address variance requests for post-construction stormwater? Good question.
Yes. Robbie, were you going to say something?
Yeah, do you want me to kind of answer it, or?
Yeah, if you've got that one, go ahead.
So, yeah, I know specifically which project this one's talking about. This was probably early after post-construction was adopted, that there were some agreements made, and being pressed by developers that we agreed to do this. The variance process is not changing in post-construction. There's not going to be a specific ban, I guess, on this specific type of item for future development. It is something that we keep an eye out for now and strongly discourage. But I would caution about putting an absolute ban on something, because there are cases where it may be beneficial, and it would limit things in other areas that people are allowed to do to treat things. But I just, for your information, that's something we do press for now, that people don't do this, because we do have examples of the outcomes.
Great. Mark Van Dyne, is there a provision for the use of proprietary stormwater treatment devices?
Hey, Mark, it's still, we're still going to push all design regulation, or not design regulations, but design requirements to the BMP manual. And so, we currently have a pilot SEM program where you can test proprietary stormwater treatment devices for credit and get them into that manual. So I don't anticipate that necessarily changing. We are working on updating the BMP manual, sort of at the tail end of the UDO, as we see what may need to change within the manual. So I don't think we anticipate any changes in allowance of proprietary devices, but utilizing the current pilot program set up to allow for the testing and inclusion of those in the future. Hopefully that helps.
So I do see more of a clarifying comment from Hermes. Was talking about the issue of litter and trash being removed from stormwater detention areas, and his follow-up was their HOA lakes receive water and litter from third-party sites and streets, so it's captured not by the source site. I don't know if anyone wants to elaborate on that. Go ahead.
Yeah, Hermes, you're exactly right. There's a lot of litter that leaves off of parking lots and streets, and it's the way we attack that is by public education, trying to connect folks with understanding that the trash makes its way into the storm drain system and into creeks and streams, and trying to encourage folks to not place trash where it can make its way into the storm drain or into a creek. We have a number of creek cleanup volunteer events that we schedule and organize every year to get citizens in the community aware of the connection of trash and how it can make its way into creeks and streams. But totally agree, it is a problem, and oftentimes it ends up on private property or in lakes and creeks that are downstream of a highly developed area. So it's an area that we're aware of, and we work to combat it the best we can.
Thanks, Daniel. So I don't see any other questions. I'll give folks another minute or two to type in their questions, but we appreciate all the back and forth so far. I think there's been some really good questions. And as we pause, if anybody from the stormwater team wants to add anything, feel free to, but we'll just kind of hang out for a minute or two here and let people maybe finish typing if they're typing in a question.
Andrew, we may have covered this. I'm not sure if we did, but Faith had asked a question earlier about staff's thoughts on mitigation measures. Did we cover that one?
We did. Jordan said he was going to share some things offline, but feel free to elaborate if you have some thoughts.
Well, I'll just say that, you know, in terms of new mitigation measures, at the onset of the meeting today, we talked about the fact that development patterns are changing in Charlotte. The process we used to have 10 or 20 years ago of very large subdivisions, theirs are still being built, but more and more we're seeing smaller and smaller developments, and our regulations were not really aligned with regulating those types of developments because they weren't as prevalent as they are today. So in terms of, you know, new mitigation measures, we just want every site that gets developed to do its fair share to help mitigate downstream flooding problems, downstream trash problems, downstream pollution problems. And so the mitigation measures are those that are contained in the post-construction ordinance. It's just that those requirements would apply to a wider variety of sites going forward. That's our hope.
Yeah, that's good context for a lot of what we did in these. Thanks for adding that. All right. Got one more from Sylvia Biddle-Patton. Thanks so much. Would like to suggest that when variances are approved, that there may be some level of accountability for those developers who initiate the request. The residual effects can't be anticipated, but it is hardly fair for later developers to be held responsible for a matter that they did not cause. I don't know if there's an answer to that, but we appreciate that feedback, and we'll certainly take that into consideration in our variance process. All right, I'm gonna move on, and if there are other questions, we can take them. But we have one more slide to talk about upcoming virtual meetings. So the online virtual conversations are going to continue through January 27th. We have had really good dialogue with the community through these. I think everyone at the UDO team has been impressed with the back and forth and the effectiveness of these meetings. And so we're going to continue through the 27th, and same format. We're going to just continue to focus on individual topics, specific topics. Have two meetings, one at the 1 o'clock hour and then one at the 6 o'clock hour. But the particular update here is that our meeting that was scheduled for January 4th, which is yesterday, has been rescheduled to January 27th. That was a session for frequent users of the UDO, so those who are developing or acquiring real estate and using the development ordinances with any level of frequency. We really wanted folks to submit questions and have us maybe get into the details that we won't necessarily cover in these more higher level meetings. So we got a couple questions, not enough to warrant an hour-long conversation. So we wanted to push it back to January 27th to allow more questions to come in. So if you haven't registered for that meeting, please visit charlotteudo.org. You can find all the registration links there. And we, you can submit questions there, or you can send them to charlotteudo@charlottemc.gov, and we'll sort of log questions there. So just kind of one more plug before we end the session today, but I don't see any other questions unless I missed something, but I'll just say thank you to everybody for coming out today and asking us some really good questions. We appreciate your time, and feel free to connect with us offline if you have any more questions about the stormwater standards.